In terms of the quality parameters, I mean, you're just looking at lignin, we just talked about that. I mean, what work do you know of that's taking place in terms of the carbohydrate levels? Can you just expand on that a bit more?
Sure. Okay, well, I did mainly focus on the lignin today because there were just some examples there, but obviously as well as the work which originated in Wales, which has led to the high sugar grasses that are available today, we've taken a different approach within the work that is now in the Dairy Futures CRC of attacking that in two ways. One is to try and be very targeted about increasing the level of sugars in grass by targeting some of the genes involved in the carbohydrate is called fructan, so it's the storage one. It's hardly available to animals. The other work that we've been doing is to use a GM approach to not only increase the amount of sugars but change where they are in the plant. One of the things about these sugars is they tend to be stored more towards the base of the plant. The plant puts them in as a survival mechanism, not for animal feed, whereas what we've done is moving the sugars up into the leaf blades so that as a cow goes along, it's basically going to harvest more without getting right down into the crown of the plant. The other work that we've been doing is to try and understand how disease resistance affects the expression of sugars in plants. I did a lot of early work with some of the material from Aberystwyth here in Australia, and we showed comprehensively that some of that early material was very, very susceptible to crown rust, and the minute it got rust, the carbohydrate levels went from quite high to nothing. The other thing was that there were big environmental effects where when we grew that material up at Gatton in Queensland or in north central Victoria, we tended to have much lower expression of carbohydrates than when we grew it in the south due to the plants respiring more in the hot nights. So we've taken a different approach about saying if we can target these under a more controlled way, we might have a mechanism that's more robust in its expression. So definitely there's a lot of work in understanding carbohydrates. It's a pet of mine. But I think the key thing about it is no matter how people get there, we are quite confident of the role of carbohydrates in dairy cattle nutrition, in that early fermentation, in getting better protein utilisation, getting better early digestion. So it's a clear target to attack as geneticists. I think some of the early material from the Dairy Futures program is probably sort of in that 3 years from animal trialling, 5 to 6 years from commercial release kind of phase. But the results are quite exciting.
Where's the link there between what you guys are doing and then linking in with nutrition work? What's sort of happening in that field at the moment?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in that field is what were originally probably two separate streams of science, to be honest. You had geneticists like myself who knew a little bit about animal nutrition saying we'll start to go down this path. We had animal nutritionists trying to understand more that complex interaction. But I guess the two groups get excited when you start to have something to talk about. So when you start to make the genetic improvements, the nutritionists start to give you some feedback saying, oh, yeah, that's all right, but if you push that too far, you're going to knock this over, or, hey, you're going to have to go that far to get that effect. So I think one of the exciting things that's happening now is that within the Dairy Futures CRC, there's starting to be a lot more interaction between plant and animal people than we've had before. And also as part of the planning of research which has happened, sponsored by Dairy Australia and other groups, is that these kind of issues are being discussed at that kind of higher level where you're getting groups understanding much better what's going on. Obviously we have to do it. I don't think we've got it perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but what I see now is a lot more excitement and cross-fertilisation of ideas than I probably saw 20 years ago, to be honest.
Look, I'd have to agree with that. And I think there's a big shift now out there in terms of understanding. I mean, before it was all about dry matter, you know. I mean, showing the photo, if we had ryegrass that was green in summer, that was great. So we went down, it was interesting, you had Kangaroo Valley there. I mean, you know, it was there, but that's all it was, you know. So there was no point having something that was green if it was, its impact and nutrition was actually quite minimal. The audience, we've got Les, Ian, Neil. Any comments from you guys to Kevin about where you see the breeding programs or things that you'd like to see happen? I mean, or does it take away the excuses, Les, for not getting milking right?
Yeah, we've just completed some studies and they're just getting close to being published on fructose and its impact on acidosis. So I guess we've got some concerns about just how much sugars we want. Obviously some are good, particularly on grey days we could do with a lot more. But obviously also at other times we need to understand the impacts of those on fermentation and what they're going to do in terms of animal health. So obviously you're considering some of those things. Have you thought about other forms of carbohydrate that might be used for storage rather than moving across into the fructans, the starches? Can we look at starches in the ryegrasses?
Yeah, we haven't actively sought to change ryegrass engineering to be a starch accumulator. I guess one of the approaches that we've taken in that space is to look at how we would, in essence, improve the quality of some of the starch accumulators. So to look at changing the digestibility of paspalum or some other grasses, so come at it that way. But I agree entirely, and I think that where we are now, we are in a much better position to bring together the science which is happening from the dosage kind of feeding that you're talking about, the sort of modelling that comes from models that are out there like Molly and other things, but also too to think about in the context of how in New Zealand, say at the Lincoln Dairy, what they're seeing is that the cows are actually functioning quite differently in terms of their acidity profiles and other things on some of that very high quality grass. So I think as you push a system, it becomes clear that the solutions are not simple. They're not one size fits all or fit one person. And I think that the challenge for us as scientists generically, I believe, is engaging with leading producers and people who are operating in that sphere to get that feedback before a product's finished. I think in the past we've had a model, and this is something that Rick and I have been talking about on the committee that we're on that Rick mentioned. We've had a model that I would say has been largely about saying let's take the risk out of everything rather than saying let's say this is a technology that potentially has a value. Let's try and understand it in the real world now. If we find out that it didn't have the value that we thought it had, well, great. That's a good finding. And I think that we need to change the way we think about the development and adoption of those innovations and acknowledge too that many, there's a bit of jargon that I've picked up, but many of the challenges, innovations that we're dealing with are what you could call high challenge innovations because they challenge the system, they challenge the way you think about the system, and they could challenge the way you do business. That could be good or it could be bad, but it is about saying to people, well, what do you think of this challenge? Does it work for you and how would you work with it?
Oh yeah, going forward, like it's definitely going to be a big part of it. Like energy, like we've got to be, well, we're out to make milk, so yeah, like it's going to be, well, it's one of the major factors. Like we've got to be able to get most energy, biggest amount of energy possible into our cows, and if pasture is going to be the cheapest form to get it there, well, this is going to be one tool we can use.
But the reason I sort of picked on Trav, and he can get me later, but you know, already on their farm, as I'm already seeing with a number of farms, and you know, and Trav's not a client of our business, but there are multiple species already. You know, I mean, I'm seeing you with annual ryegrasses through to perennial ryegrasses through to lucerne, corn, I reckon you're up around probably at any given point in time you have 10 species growing there, or cultivars I should say, not necessarily species, but multiple cultivars within the ryegrass. And the biggest shift I've seen is, as we've talked many times, Kevin, that there is a greater level of understanding between agronomy and nutrition at the moment on how these things fit. It'd be interesting within your own farm systems, think about, in the past where it used to be, okay, they went out to grass in the morning. The simple thing, the first start was they'd go to some annuals. We wouldn't feed annuals twice in the one day. We'd have the annuals in the morning and maybe perennials at night to try and balance feeds out. To now there are shifts within rations at each point of the day.
So,
yes, sorry, Les?
I reckon I just had a little moment to myself there when I was contemplating a ryegrass that had modified endophytes and only sort of functional lignin. Because, but I sort of can't help feeling that what we need at the end of the day is something more simple rather than more complicated. And I have this view that we start off with a simplistic view of the world. It necessarily has to get really complicated. And through that complication, we get to understand what's really important. Then we want to simplify it. And I guess what I'm sort of optimistic about is that the strategies Kevin's using are potentially going to give us a fairly simple farming system. Because if we're concentrating on the right variables, and I'm not sure that I want ryegrass that's got too much starch in it myself, because the more I become reliant on that, the less flexibility I have with how I feed the cows. But what we do want to do is have ryegrass that's really predictable in the way it behaves.
Yeah.
And once we've got that predictability, then we can build predictability in what we supplement it with.
Yeah.
And that seems to me the real key.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Les. I'd say we already have a very complex system. We're dealing with complex biology in the grass. We're dealing with a complex biology in the animal. And then we have all the environmental effects and the management overlay on that. So we have a complex system now. I think your point about saying, will it be less complex? I don't know. Will it be more predictable? I would hope so. And I think that one of the key things that I'd like to talk about this afternoon in the workshops is around how do we make sure that these new pastures that are coming, whether they're developed with these technologies or exclude these technologies, are described in the right way. That means you can get that predictability because we've asked the right questions of the scientists, evaluators and marketers. And one of the things that I think we are still babes in the woods about is we've moved a little bit from the dry matter descriptions that Rick talked about, as that's where we were 20 years ago. We're starting to think about, we'll put some quality attributes on there. But I think that's probably where I'm very keen to work in the next little bit, but I think it's where we've got the biggest opportunity, and I think that will then lead to that predictability that you're talking about. And then people, rather than making decisions based on a cultivar marketing strategy or what was available in the seed store today or whatever, all those other things that come into it, they can say, on my farm, I want this paddock that I'm sowing to do this,